MFA Writers. We're excited to have you here and also excited to be on Thanksgiving break. This week, we are hanging with friends and family and taking a break from our computers. So instead of a new episode, we have a re-release of one of our favorites from last season, a special debut author episode with Jonathan Escoffery, writer of the wonderful book, If I Survive You. We'll be back in a couple weeks with a new interview. Until then, you can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. We love to hear from listeners, so feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms, or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Also, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, you can apply at mfawriters.com. On that same website, you can also click the support button to support us financially, if it's within your means. Or you can do so by going directly to buymeacoffee.com/mfawriters. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today we've got a special episode for you with Jonathan Escoffery, the debut author behind the super successful short story collection If I Survive You, which was longlisted for the National Book Award and the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence, and was a finalist for the Southern Book Prize and a Golden Poppy Award. It is published in the U.S. by MCD and FSG. Jonathan is a graduate of the University of Minnesota's Creative Writing MFA program and currently attends the University of Southern California's PhD in Creative Writing and Literature program as a Provost Fellow. On top of that, he's a 2021-2023 Wallace Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. Before we chat, Jonathan is going to read an excerpt for us from his debut book.
Yes, I'm going to be reading from the story Splashdown, which happens to appear about halfway through the book. And I'm actually reading from the second section in the story. So this is section 2. And I know that might be a little bit random in terms of choices for reading, but I think this passage speaks to the theme of father-son relationships, which is a kind of running thread throughout the book. And so I'll take it from here. And this is from this story follows the character Cookie, who met his father for the first time the summer he turned 13. And this is picking up after they've had a falling out and haven't spoken for years. His baby boy had emerged, slippery and screaming into the world when the panic began blooming inside Cookie. They'd agreed on Julius after Leanne's grandfather, and once Julius had been wiped clean, swaddled in a hospital blanket, handed to Leanne, exhausted, red-faced in spite of her brown skin, she'd had the wherewithal, after minutes of staring, of breathing him in, to spin Julius toward Cookie, saying, "Look, your nose." But Cookie had already recognized it, like an arrowhead glued to a sapling. Of the anxieties Cookie had brought into the delivery room, passing down his least cherished feature had not been one. He had, of course, considered whose face he'd eventually come to see in his son's, his or Leanne's, or some ne'er-even split, or else neither, though Cookie figured that would reveal itself over years, months at the earliest. Among his anxieties, he had recently dreamed that Baptist staff had misplaced Julius in a ward of indistinguishable newborns, as all newborns to him had been indistinguishable up to this point, and that Julius would never be recovered with any certainty. Chief among his anxieties had been the money, that there wasn't any. Now, though, his boy appeared fated, as he himself had been fated, to see his father everywhere he saw himself. Leanne lifted Julius for Cookie to take, and Cookie edged toward the door, saying, "I'll be back." "You'll be back?" Cookie heard Leanne ask, though he was already making his way down the hall, dropping his grubs on the hospital floor. It wasn't until Cookie saw his boy's face that he knew he would have to do something drastic to save his family from destitution. He's just turned off US 1 onto the bridge that will lift him over the hem of the Atlantic, and after a mile or so, land him in the midst of Smuggler's Key for the first time in 4 years. Every once in a while, he takes his sight off the asphalt in front of him and pushes it over the aluminum rail to search out fishing vessels down in the water. Not seeing many, he thinks there's still time. His headlights are becoming unnecessary as night recedes, his truck's nose already dipping towards smugglers. He's rehearsing greetings for when he pulls up to his father's tiki bar. Hey, Pop. Or, remember me, deadbeat? He's got to play it cool, though, to humble himself. He practices the words. Do you have any work for me? Work I can fall back on? And I'll stop reading there.
All right, Jonathan, I appreciate it. Thanks for reading. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I'm sure you've heard this a million times by now, but this is an incredible book. Really, I mean,
Thank you.
I loved it.
No author can get tired of hearing that.
Good. All right. Well, I was totally enthralled by it. Not just like the story you're telling, which is of course really engrossing and moving and saying something really important, but I was also interested in the form of the book. In your bio, I called it a collection of short stories, but I mean, I suppose that's what it is, since you could pull any of these out and like read them on their own and they would work. But together, the stories read like chapters in a novel. I also noticed that it doesn't say on the front of the book a novel or stories, which most books will have that kind of in small print there. So how do you think of this book? Would you call it a collection or a novel, or would you just prefer to forget the labels?
I think I'd prefer to forget the labels personally. Just thinking about the different ways that the I was about to say that the novel came to be. I mean that the book came to be, because at times, honestly, I thought I was working on a novel, and then at other times, I thought I was working on a linked story collection, or even times, it was a much less linked story collection. But I knew I had a book once I realized the kind of world that I was building out with these different characters and these different members of the family. Cookie, who I was reading about, a minute ago, he's the cousin character of Trelawney and Delano, both of whom get probably more page and stage time in the book. But with the larger narrative following this family, I mean, I think that's the thing I was interested in. But the people who've talked about the book or written about the book, they're calling it a novel. They're calling it stories. And part of that, we set it up that way by not putting a subtitle on the cover, I think. But also, as you said, the way it reads, it kind of operates as both. And maybe I wanted to have the best of both worlds, or have it both ways, I guess is
right.
Another way to put it.
Yeah, nothing wrong with a little ambiguity. So how did it start? Because you said like there were times that you thought you were writing a novel. Sometimes you thought you were writing a story collection. Did you think from the very beginning you were going to write a longer work, or did you write in one of these short stories and then realize there was more to be told?
I was actually preparing my writing sample for applications for MFA programs, and a story. I actually thought I had my writing sample set. I was meeting with two of my closest friends who are both also applying to MFA programs, and around November 15th, we were meeting just to exchange work, and a little bit before we met, this story kind of poured out of me that it was the only story I've ever sat down and just written in, a few hours, basically. And it was a story about Trelawney and Delano and Topper and their difficulties around the living situation with Delano and Trelawney. And that is the difficulty being that Delano hasn't been paying his rent. And Topper, the father, wants Trelawney, the younger brother, to do something about it. And I was interested in kind of exploring this difficult situation between these family members that, in a sense, is kind of impossible because, Delano is not paying his rent, but the father kind of favors him and refuses to do anything about it, refuses to evict him. And yet he's putting the responsibility back onto the younger son, the other roommate in a sense, the other tenant. And I thought just the story, it was very short, again, like 5 pages, but I thought it was really full of life in a way that some of my earlier writing might have been lacking, or maybe I was just, I was a lot more interested in these characters in this story. And so I wound up writing that, showing my friends. They had a really enthusiastic response to it. So I wound up submitting that to to the University of Minnesota, where I wound up attending, and to some other programs that I did and didn't get into. But I started to think of this story that I wrote as a kind of chapter one to a novel. And I really believed that that's how it was going to wind up in a future book. And so I started to write, chapter two, and it was immediately following the brother character, Delano. And I was trying to explore like all of the characters who had popped up in this very short writing sample, opening chapter, story, whatever, whatever it was. And I really had a difficult time writing forward that way. And I really had to kind of step away from the idea that this was going to be a novel that was going to start where that story started. And I needed to kind of step back and start exploring these characters in different ways. But for a very long time, I really thought I was writing a novel that I did want all of the chapters to stand alone. I don't know why that was so important to me, but I felt like, well, if I'm going to write a novel, it should be like the perfect novel that could be excerptable. I think to my credit, I think I had an idea that it would be helpful to my career if I could pull pieces out of the book and start placing those at magazines to start, building some kind of presence in the literary world.
So you mentioned that when you wrote that initial piece, it had like an energy that your other work didn't have. I'm curious to hear you talk about why you think that was. I write fiction as well. I get tired of people reading the stuff I write and just assuming it's me in the story and that it's like based on my real life. But so I don't want to like draw any conclusions about this book and your own actual lived experience, but it seems like there's some influence coming from your own life and upbringing. The main character, Trelawney, also grew up in Miami, studied English in college. So I don't know, was this the first time that some of those aspects of your life were finding their way into your work? You think that influenced the energy of it?
That's true, I think. Yes. I was writing before that, I was writing stories that were set in places that I hadn't spent much time, or, I was focusing on a more plot driven fiction that was kind of independent of the characters that were being plugged into these storylines. And maybe that was around the first time I was like the conflict was coming directly out of these characters and who they were. But then they were also characters who were very close to, my identity, my lived experience. And it was also among the first times where I was writing about just difficult situations that don't have easy answers, and about family in a way that I find family to be the unsolvable problem, because you just can't or maybe I'd have a different answer if I sought therapy, but but my therapy is in the writing, I think. But how do you solve a problem like being in a family where you have one sibling and that sibling is the favorite and you're kind of not? And it's like, what can you actually do about such a thing? But my job as the author was to try to make that compelling on the page. And it was the first time I wrote a story that I thought was incredibly funny. And my first readers had that same response. And I think I'd kind of broken out of this idea that to be a serious writer, I had to write something that felt like very serious. And, the topics were serious, but it was delivered in a way that was biting and humorous. And I wanted to continue to seek out that energy, which was another thing that was very difficult because I'd written this opening, again, like quote unquote chapter that I knew it was kind of funny. Like even in talking to my advisors once I got into the MFA, and they were like, you can write humor like really well, and that was so. I felt the pressure of that. Like, how am I going to now sustain humor throughout an entire book?
Yeah.
Like, how do you do that? I'm not even sure where the humor was coming from. I hadn't been at the time, at least, and so it was very easy to get in my head with a lot of expectations that I was setting up for myself. And that made it kind of difficult. So I had to kind of step away and just think about, well, you wrote that story. Can you just write another story, another good story, maybe a better story, and just start taking it from there and see, do you understand these different modes of storytelling? And through that process, that was really helpful.
So I've heard from other writers, specifically emerging writers in MFA programs, about this issue of expectation. They get in these programs and they feel like there are certain expectations they have to live up to, or they publish that first story and suddenly it's like, oh man, now I have to write the next one, right? Which seems like it should, like once you've figured it out, the next one should come easy, right? But it doesn't work like that, right? It's still a lot of hard work. So how did you manage those expectations? How did you get over that and get back to just like the basics and just trying to write a good story again?
Yeah, that's a good question. Deadlines helped. I mean, if there was anything that was really, in terms of the MFA, in terms of a graduate program helping me get this book written insofar as it did, those deadlines were really helpful, because I would spin my wheels for a long time, and then I was the person who wrote stories like overnight right before class. And so there's the story. It appears, it's the penultimate story in the collection, which is told from Delano, the older brother's point of view. They used to be called The Bucket, and then I changed the name right before I sent it to American Short Fiction and made it like a long, playful name that I can almost never remember. It's like if he suspected he'd get someone killed this morning, Delano would never leave the couch. There, I did remember.
You did.
But that's one where it's like I didn't go to sleep the night before, and I just wrote like I don't know, like 25 pages somehow. And it had the movements. And I think the only reason I could do that was because that's one of the stories in the book that does kind of have a clear movement that suggests like structured plots, I guess. Delano has to go to like 3 places in order to fulfill the goal that he has set out. And I think knowing that created writerly momentum, where I knew, well, you have to get him into this garage where he has to steal his truck back. You have to get him to convince these workers to come do the job. You have to convince the property manager to give you the bid that's going to allow you to work on her trees before this hurricane hits, and that kind of thing. Which is me getting a little bit outside of the question, but those deadlines really helped. The pressure never came off until I was finished with my MFA program, and then I had to figure out how to just be a human in the world again, and get a job, and still figure out how to find time to write, which was very difficult. But nobody was really looking. No one was really looking for the stories, and to me, that's really when the pressure came off and the writing really started to flourish.
Interesting. So, I mean, like in my experience, writer's block is often like, it's often just about having too high of expectations when you're sitting down and trying to draft a story. It's like, I expect the story to be perfect, like as it comes from my fingertips to the keyboard, right? And like when it's not perfect, then I get stuck. So it's interesting to hear like having the deadlines where it's like, well, I don't have any choice. I have to get this thing done in the next few hours. So I just got to push through this draft and get it done. But then when you got out of the MFA program, not having those deadlines, having that free space also freed something up. So it's interesting. It's like, it's like every time you try to like articulate a process or articulate how to do this the right way, it's like there's immediately a contradiction, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's one of the hardest things about this whole thing, I think.
Yeah.
There was a movement from, and possibly this happened in the MFA. If not, it would have been kind of closely after I finished the program. But the movement from believing that it's easier to write a first draft than it is to revise one. I remember, I mean, I could vaguely basically remember back when I used to think writing a first draft was not easy, not easy at all, but easier. It felt like, once it was written, it must have been written the right way. And so changing things felt very painful to me once upon a time. And now it's the exact opposite. Like, I don't even think I know what the story is until I start revising that first draft. The first draft is just kind of getting ideas out on the page. And it's when you come in with that revision, the editor who starts to organize things and see, hey, or say, hey, like, this is the interesting part. Here's the heart of it. Here's where things need to switch around. Here's how we can shape this. I mean, the only thing I think that's good about expectations maybe is when you know that you want to try something new on the page. For me, I never want to write the same story twice or write a story. Like, it's like once I know how I've figured out how to tell a certain kind of story, like, I'm not super interested in revisiting that mode of storytelling.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit because, the overall form of the book is really interesting, but also each individual story takes some interesting risks. So, like, as I mentioned, the main character, Trelawney, gets a lot of time on the page, right? But there's also stories that focus on his father, his brother, and his cousin, like the story you read from. The stories mostly move forward chronologically, but they overlap at times. Some stories are in first or third person, while others are in second person. They're sometimes told in past or present or future tense. So I'm curious about your process when writing an individual story. So, like, how do you decide to make some of those decisions? Or is it less about making a decision to do those things and more about just playing around until something clicks?
There's a lot of play at hand, I think. I mean, I know. There's play in a way that's like, okay, I read Michael Ondaatje's Running in the Family, and which is a kind of, it's a memoir, but he is filling in all of this information that he just doesn't have, and so there's at times fictionalization, and the narrative in that book is often interrupted by a different narrative that comes in, and the author is interrupting himself. William Maxwell's So Long, See You Tomorrow does a lot of that. And so when I was writing a story like Pestilence is told in that retrospective, first person, past tense story narrative mode. And, that was me coming in and saying, like, I love that kind of storytelling. Like, let me see if I can actually pull off that kind of storytelling. And bridging those influences and that kind of those inspirations. I'm the worst storyteller in my family. I might be the best writer in my family, but I'm the worst storyteller. And so if you get my family around a kitchen table, like, the way they tell stories, it's to me, it's really engaging, entertaining, lots of humor, but you'll hear the same stories over the years, which is, that's just how family is. Yeah. Right. But the stories, you'll notice they'll change depending on the size of the audience, or maybe maybe they recognize they've been telling the story for years, so now they're amping it up, they're exaggerating things, or just depending on the mood. Like, sometimes you'll hear a story and it's really humorous, it's really funny, and then you might hear that story another time and there's one piece of information, or maybe just the tone it's told in, it's actually like a tragic story. And so I wanted to in a way, like, paying homage to the ways family oral storytelling can play out and shift, and the different things that we learn. I mean, I know even after my dad died a couple months ago, and I had dinner with his sister, my aunt, a few weeks back, and she was telling me a story that he told me all these different times, and it's like I'd heard it in like 5 different ways just from my dad, but then hearing it from his sister was, a totally different way, and there were new pieces of information. And I just love the way a story can evolve. And so, in my own writing, in using that story, Pestilence, as an example, like thinking about the way story evolves. And for us writers, like the way a story can evolve within itself, the way you can supply multiple versions of a story within the same story, and hopefully pull that off in a way that's actually satisfying to a reader. And we learn a lot about storytelling. We learn a lot about humanity, hopefully. And so, I just, depending on what I'm finding kind of interesting at a given time, like that's what I'm bringing to the page. And I knew, just to stick with that story, like I was imagining Trelawney basically, like we meet him at all these different moments of crisis throughout the book. So for listeners who haven't read the book, Trelawney has a kind of major falling out with his father. He's kicked out of the house. He starts living out of his vehicle. He starts taking on really odd jobs. So we follow him on these different jobs. And I was imagining him being in these difficult situations, but he's also still got the family dynamics going on. And so I wanted to write a story that was him really trying to unpack like what set him up to have this strained family, or these strained family dynamics between his brother and his father. And so, that was another motivation for that particular retrospective first person narrative mode.
What do you think the benefit was to branching out and telling stories kind of from the perspective of these other family members? Because, I was reading it and I kept thinking like Jonathan could have written an entire novel just focusing on Trelawney and it would have been amazing. But like getting these different perspectives to me adds something. And I'm curious to hear like what your thought process was in doing that.
Yeah. Particularly with Trelawney's father, Topper, and his brother, Delano. Delano came first. I knew, because there were these tensions with them. I already knew there was going to be the tensions of them living in the house and kind of fighting over who has more of a claim to the house. Delano has lived there longer. He literally helped put the roof back on the house after Hurricane Andrew blew it off. But at the same time, Delano hasn't been paying rent for years, and Trelawney has stepped in, and he's been the only one kind of paying his share of the rent/mortgage, with their father being the owner of the house. And knowing that they had these tensions, I wanted to give Delano his say, basically, because I didn't want him to be cast like only in this kind of villainous position that Trelawney can sometimes cast him in. And similar, the same could be said for Topper, with that major tension between that father-son tension. I wanted to give Topper his own story because, he's not the most present. I try to avoid the words like good and bad, but like he's not the most present father when these boys are children, and he's not the most present husband, particularly once the family moves from Jamaica to Miami. And so I wanted to give him his point of view, so we see like, well, what's he thinking? Like, why does he think what he does is okay? What are his motivations? What are the larger systemic issues that are maybe putting pressure on him to, try to seek employment out in these social settings late at night that are keeping him from being home with his family? How is our economic system that has very few social nets setting him up to be, a kind of poor father, poor husband? And so I wanted to explore that. So, it's almost like me saying I wanted to be fair to those other characters.
Yeah.
One other thing, like Delano, in Trelawney's eyes, he can't lose, and it's like in most of the stories he can't. He's up in all these different ways, but I wanted to focus on him when he was down. Like, what does it look like for Delano, the family favorite, the person who everybody likes, when he's down and out? Like, what does that look like?
So I also want to talk a bit about your journey to this moment, having released your debut book to some much deserved praise and success. A lot of our listeners are emerging writers who are in creative writing programs or applying to MFAs. you've been in their shoes, you've attended an MFA and a PhD in creative writing. So I'm curious what message or advice you have for those listening who hope to get where you are one day. Or in other words, what would you say to a younger Jonathan Escoffery just entering the MFA program at Minnesota?
I would say be patient, be as patient as possible. I definitely felt that I needed to publish or start publishing right away. I don't know. I had these expectations. I mean, one simple one that I've heard from a lot of faculty, I'd been told myself, like, don't expect to have a finished book by the end of this program. A better goal might be to understand, like, what kind of artist are you trying to be, or what kind of artist are you striving to be? Figuring out your interests, or what it is that you're going to be writing about in the near future, or in the long term, like trying to figure out what it is exactly that is going to drive you and keep you engaged as a writer. Figuring out your project, not in a specific way, like you necessarily know the book, but when I've been talking a bit about like father-son relationships, or another thing, it was pivotal to me to start understanding that I wanted to actually talk about the Jamaican American experience, or a Jamaican American experience. Writing about Miami became like really valuable to me, and that was valuable to me once I moved away. I mean, in particular, when I moved away from Miami, I was able to kind of contrast it to places not Miami. And so, being a little bit patient. But there are other things that are, I think, more tangible, which is, I would say read a lot, read widely, but also read in terms of people who you think might be in conversation with your work, because that's going to teach you a lot about what can be done successfully in terms of subject matter, or maybe even your writing style. I think something that was super helpful to me was joining the staff of my MFA's literary journal. So I joined as the fiction editor. And so being able to see what people were submitting, especially in mass, and seeing like, okay, I only have so much patience. You, as the person who's receiving those submissions, you only have so much patience. You only have so much time. And so like a really meandering open-end page, or vague open-end page, stories that aren't grounded in character or place, or time, or conflict. If you're still searching for like, what is this by page 2, editors don't have time to kind of figure that out. And so that taught me a lot about how I needed to be thinking about my own work that I was going to be submitting. I'd say, some of us, probably all of us, have weaknesses in our writing, and you're bound to have people point that out in workshop. But for me, I think it's really helpful to lean into your strengths and figure out what it is that you're good at and you enjoy doing, and just like do more of that. Which I'm sure there's some good advice for why you want to still get stronger at those weaknesses. But if you're, I think if you're always chasing, like trying to be like so well-rounded, like you can forget about that thing that you already kind of do really well. You could forget about that muscle. So I would lean into those strengths. And I think maybe the last thing I'll say for now is, sometimes when you're surrounded by, I don't know, like 10 people, 20 people, 30 people, you start to think that that's your entire world. And that's going to be your entire world forever, in a sense. Even though you're in a 2-year program or a 3-year program, like somehow you still, it's very easy to start to believe that the entire world, what those other students and professors around you value, is like the only things that can be valued or should be valued. And there's such a bigger world out there, and so understanding, hopefully you found your way into a program that actually does value what you do. But, it always breaks my heart to hear a writer say, like, I quit writing because those 4 other writers in my cohort didn't value what I do. And It's like, if you let those few other people who happen to not necessarily get what it is that you're working towards. It can be helpful to already have some authors in mind who probably would be your ideal readers because your work is in conversation. But I mean, the other angle on that, I think, is sometimes I know after my maybe after year one, some of the advice I got that didn't immediately resonate started to make more sense a couple of years down the road, or even, back when I was still hanging on to my feedback letters, maybe a year after I'd finished my MFA, some of it, again, it started to make more sense to me. And I think, if you could be kind to your classmates in terms of their, your critique of their work. Sometimes it's like a relationship, what they say is like, you can be happy or you could be right sometimes.
Yeah, right.
And, I think fighting to like eviscerate your classmate because you have a point that you really, really need to dig in. It's like, sometimes it's not really worth it to do that. Sometimes it's actually better just to build community and among people who, they might be an editor at a place you want to get published someday, or they might go on to be a good reader for you of your work. Or there's just lots of different ways where it's always better, I've found, to be to be kind. And then the point I was making before is like, sometimes you don't get someone's feedback, and that doesn't necessarily make them a bad person
Right.
who you have to write off just because they didn't get that one story that one time. And sometimes that feedback they gave actually is good. You just weren't ready to hear it. And so, just try to give yourself grace and give your classmates grace.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. And it's good to keep in mind that each person who reads your work is just one reader. And that goes for classmates or professors or editors at literary magazines, right? Just because you get a rejection doesn't mean your story's bad. It's just one reader, and there's so many other variables that go into it.
Right.
So that's one side of, the community that you end up in when you go into one of these programs. And there are some pitfalls in being in those communities, but I'm also curious to hear what kind of benefits you feel you've gotten over the years from the writing communities that you've been involved in, because you've been in an MFA program, a PhD, you've done various residencies, fellowships. So how important has community been to your success as a writer?
Yeah, it's been really helpful. And I'll say, I mean, one of the things that I don't know if I regret it, but again, thinking about the MFA or any grad program as the entirety of your world is probably not the best idea. For me, it was really helpful to do like Breadloaf, thinking of summer conferences. I'm also a Combilio Fiction Fellow, which is they do something like it's like a scaled down version, but there are these different fellowships that are identity based. So Combilio Fiction is for writers of the African diaspora. And these different summer conferences or summer workshops can be really helpful to building community in a way that gives you, I think, a broader perspective on the literary landscape. A place like Breadloaf gives you the opportunity to actually talk one-on-one with editors and agents. It puts you into proximity with a lot of writers who are doing interesting things all around the country, as writers who live all over the country converge on this one place for 7 or 10 days. And when I did Breadloaf, I did the work study waiter scholarship, and I'm still in touch. That was 4 years ago now, and I'm still very much in touch with those people, a lot more so than I am in touch with people from my MFA. And so many of my cohort at Breadloaf, at least half of them have come out with books, and they've been able to give me really crucial feedback in terms of, and I said feedback, but I mean like advice, and I'm not talking about advice on my writing. I'm talking about like when it's time to go on book tour, like how do you actually like manage all these airports, and how do you actually conserve energy? And I've gotten good advice. Get your TSA pre-check. Do the Claire service where you just walk up and scan your eyes and get on your plane, basically. It's been helpful to submit to magazines, submit stories to magazines that have a local presence. Something that I like to think about when, in terms of submissions, is like how many different positive outcomes can I get from one submission? So Zizova is located in San Francisco. I live in Oakland, so I live right next door, and they're the type of community that puts on a lot of reading. So I've read several times with Zizova, which when you show up for these readings, oftentimes you're meeting other writers and you're connecting with them. And some of those writers or non-writers for that matter are editors at other magazines that you might be interested in having your work featured in. And oftentimes those editors, they'll hear what you read and like it, and then they'll reach out to you. And now you can skip the slush pile, which means your work starts to get picked up a lot quicker. Other magazines have things like classes or they're associated with conferences. They might reach out to you to teach classes. They might have more benefits than just the one publication. Because the thing is that, like, to me, the saddest thing is putting my story out in a magazine and then kind of never hearing anything about it again. So making sure magazines are actively nominating for things like Pushcart or submitting stories for Best American Short Stories, or other genres have their versions, Best American Poetry and all that. Or some of the magazines have internal award systems. So like Prairie Schooner has an annually they award a good percentage of the people who are contributors to their magazines. And so that's one where, a year after I published, I was notified that I won an award and there was money attached to it. And that's always a great thing because you get money. But then you could also put that award on your CV or whatever. You get more attention, tweet it out or whatever, put it on IG. The Parish Review is, another one that has its, that was like a really, my career took off as a result of the Parish Review publication and then the Plimpton Prize, which I won a year after I published there. And whenever you can get that two for two for the price of one story, to me, like, those are the places that you want to be submitting your work. Once it's time to start submitting your work, once you actually feel like, okay, I've written the thing, I've revised it, I've shown it to people, I've stepped away from it, I've come back to it, there's nothing I would change. Like, that's when you really want to start submitting your work.
So you mentioned briefly navigating the world of being a published author. And I wanted to ask you about this because, like, this season on the podcast, we've been asking our guests, who are mostly current MFA students, to tell us one way in which the MFA experience has been different, for better or for worse, from their expectations when applying. So I wanted to ask you a slightly different version of this, which is, what is one way in which the publishing experience, having published a book, has been different, for better or for worse, from your expectations when you first started sending out writing?
It's really difficult to know what is going to feel like a success, I think. So I mean, here's the thing, right? And this is directly related to my experience of getting the book published. But when you're going the traditional publishing route, typically you have an agent, and your agent goes on submission to a bunch of publishers, a bunch of editors. And after however you wind up agreeing to a deal, whether that's, you get some kind of preempt, you have a big auction, whatever it is, after the excitement of that, things get really, really quiet. And it's almost like depressingly so. And I've talked to other authors, and it's like there's this huge up for every, and I'll say this, for every real success, for every high, a low follows. And part of that might be, you're adjusting to the new normal. But then you start, eventually you do start hearing from people. You start hearing from your publishing team, and you start getting closer to publication date. And it's just really difficult to know what's going to feel like, okay, this is it. I've arrived. It might actually be your book launch, if you even do a book launch at typically a bookstore or somewhere that's willing to carry your book. but it might not be. It might not be then. You may actually never have that feeling. And I've had a lot of press hits, a lot of media hits, and some of them have felt like, oh, yeah, that was all right. And then some of them have felt like, it's to me, it's like always the surprising ones that I like the most. It's the ones that I never really anticipated. Those are always the funnest kind of surprises where it's like, okay, all right, this is this author thing is it's not so bad. It's kind of cool, but I've found it, and in talking to other people with books, especially talking to a lot of debut authors, 2022 debuts, it's really hard to know because there really is no finish line. That was kind of a surprising thing. And you're still like waiting. I think this is just human nature that you're still kind of waiting on something, and that thing that thing may never actually arrive. And I think what that thing is actually is once the promo quiets down a little bit, it's like you're surprisingly waiting for things to be quiet so you can just start working on your next project. And maybe that's the finish line that I'm looking forward to.
So what's the publicity tour been like? I mean, I imagine you've done like a million interviews. I mean, I should say, thank you for coming on. I'm really glad that you agreed to do the interview, but I'm sure you've got to be getting tired of doing these interviews over and over again. Has it been exhausting?
So last week, I had my first week where it wasn't exhausting. Things just aligned so that even my class at Stanford, my weekly workshop got canceled. Before that, I was having at least one podcast or one interview of some kind for interviews for magazines or whatever it may be, at least one a day, and then sometimes like three a day. And wow. Yes, it's really exhausting. And when I wasn't doing those, I was hopping on a plane to get to whatever city or whatever book festival, whatever country for that matter. And yeah, I mean, it's exhausting, and I might just be someone who doesn't have like I'm an introvert. I like people, but I'm a borderline like ambivert. Like I do eventually need people, but being around people and talking to people usually isn't a thing that refills my energy. It usually takes a lot more than it gives back. And so it's been a struggle to keep energized at times. It's also very exciting, and I have to remind myself, hey, you asked for this, you prayed for the, you did all the things, every birthday candle you blew out, every, shooting star you may have come across in the night sky. You've been wishing for this for, as long as you can remember, in a sense. And so, I try to also keep the the attitude of gratitude, as they say, along with that. But yeah, it's been, but even, I mean, going back to like the surprising, sometimes the conversation, the interview that you were excited about because it might be associated with the outlet that you've always wanted to, do an interview with. Sometimes those go great, and then sometimes those are like, oh, like that was kind of like draining. And then sometimes the conversations that weren't on your radar are the ones that actually are like really energizing, and
right.
and you come away with, it's like, oh, that was, I didn't even know that I was going to have such a great conversation, and you come away like actually energized from those. And so just, you never know. There are lots of surprises in the whole process of doing the promo for the book.
And to top it all off, you're in a PhD program right now at USC. So how are you balancing all of this, being a writer, being a student, being a promoter of your work?
I'm not balancing, really, honestly. So from my first year, I moved up to Oakland to do the Stegner Fellowship, which, the main demands is that you show up for a weekly workshop. And so my first year I was here, I was still doing the PhD and balancing some things, and also preparing for the book to come out. And I would say with the book promo was successful. I would say everything I did for Stanford and the Segner was successful, but the PhDing part was really falling apart. So this last year, academic year 2022 23, I've taken, I'm on leave technically from USC because there's if I'm going to do a thing, I like to do it well, and otherwise, like even if I know I'm kind of not doing it well, and as part of the plan, that thing is still going to take up a lot of brain space that I could be using elsewhere. And so, yeah, once I finish at Stanford in June, I'll be freed up to return to PhDing. And then, writing is another struggle. I mean, I've been glad to have the Stanford workshop to, again, give me those deadlines so that I can be forced to write something new, or even at times bring back earlier stories and seeing whether or not I can revise them into something worthwhile. And still, it's a struggle. And the thing that maybe they do tell you, maybe they don't, about putting a book out is it's a full-time job. And so if you already have a full-time job, or if you're in some other kind of program where you have other responsibilities, my advice to people who are further along in the process and looking at actually putting the book out, actually publishing a book, is like clear as much off your schedule as possible, because like your book is your job and it's your number one job. And if you want it to go well, like it should be. And that's my advice for the people who are further along.
Well, I, again, really appreciate you taking the time to come by. It's been really great getting your insight on the book, which I absolutely loved, and then getting some of your advice on publishing and your experience in all these different writing communities. It's been really great chatting with you, and I appreciate it. Yeah,
it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for having me. I look forward to watching more of your episodes. I was peeking into some of them, and I've been getting like really this weird feeling of retrospective advice that I was like, oh yeah, like that would have been really great like 8 years ago.
Well, our lucky listeners got a bunch of good advice today, so thanks again.